Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Designing the Perfect Map with ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. I'm Christina Singh, a Technical Solutions Specialist in the Toronto office, and with me today is Mark Ho.
Hey, how's it going?
For office. Hi, Mark.
Hey.
So for those of you who haven't attended one of our webinars, we are recording the session, and we'll email you the recording along with a PDF of the slides after the webinar. If you have any follow-up questions about this webinar, feel free to contact Mark or myself. Just a quick overview of today's webinar. We are looking at how you can create maps, publish posters with data-driven maps and layers directly inside of Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, which will be connected to your ArcGIS Online organization. This webinar will introduce you this new ArcGIS plugin that enables a seamless experience for producing and sharing maps with your design and branding. So intended audience for this webinar is really geared towards design professionals and cartographers familiar with Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop and the ArcGIS platform. Okay. We are open to questions. You can ask any questions about the content at any time using the Q&A panel. So be sure to choose Ask All Panelists to type your question in the box and click Send. And we'll also be taking questions through the webinar. And if we miss it, we'll get a list of the questions and we'll email you back the answers when after the webinar. So today's agenda will introduce you one of the newest extension, ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. We'll first take a look at what this product can do for you and describe some setup and preparation required to get started. We'll then see how you can design the map using vector maps with Adobe Illustrator. And lastly, we'll discover how you can use this add-on to create your raster-based maps with Adobe Photoshop. So moving on to our first topic of the day, how to get started on ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. So first things first, let's start from the very beginning. What is ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud? The basic idea of this extension is to take content from inside the ArcGIS world and bring them into the Adobe world. The goal is to ultimately provide better connections between the maps that you create in ArcGIS and the design community that primarily works with the Adobe projects. You will have direct access to data-driven maps and spatial content from ArcGIS community, and also you will have maps directly. You can add maps directly to your workspace in Adobe or Photoshop as vector layers or high-resolution images. You can also share map assets between designers and GIS analysts. So this extension was released a few weeks ago. It will enable design and communication professionals to choose from millions of data-driven maps. And then through those easy and familiar tools, any Adobe user can quickly find and discover data and build simple, clean, and informative maps for multiple output mediums. So who would use ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud? In this picture, I think cartographer and designers are the main, will be the main users for this extension. The GIS analyst, however, plays another role for sharing map assets to the community. And by using this extension, designers can access those map assets through the Esri ArcGIS platform. And one example would be designers will be able to include maps on your posters and things like that. So why would you want to use Adobe Creative Cloud. First, it will allow you to quickly search and add hosted maps and layer content to Illustrator or Photoshop from multiple sources, such as you can use our Esri maps, commercial, vendors, open data sources. You can add it from your own organization. You have the option to work with vector layers or high-resolution images. It's really your choice. You can also use street maps, boundaries, terrain, satellite images, and pretty much any other spatial data. You will have control for your artwork. So once you get the design-ready vector layers and high-resolution images inside Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop, aesthetic design and style is really up to you. So it really lets you to make beautiful maps as you want. And it will provide a seamless experience. You know, you can use the tools you are familiar with in Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator while keeping data and file formats in sync between ArcGIS and Adobe. And also, another important factor is existing GIS data and analytics are utilized by non-GIS users and departments in your organization. So it's really a return on the data investment and data maintenance that you currently already have. So that's take a look at how to get started on setting up the Adobe Creative Cloud. So the support environment for this extension, first you need to have Adobe Creative Cloud. It is available for download and install from the Adobe add-ons website. You do need an Adobe Creative Cloud account to do that. And then you install Adobe Illustrator Creative Cloud 2015 or higher, or the Photoshop version. And then you go to the add-on website to acquire the ArcGIS Maps for Office Creative Cloud extension for your account. And then it will be accessible through the extension in your application once the automatic install is completed. So to use it, it sounds complicated, but Mark will show us a demonstration in just a few minutes. And then you sign into your ArcGIS Online organization to access your data, and off you go. And let's talk about how to configure your ArcGIS Online organization with Adobe Creative Cloud. So web maps and layers hosted in your ArcGIS Online organization can be made to appear in the compilation window in Adobe Creative Cloud or Photoshop. Adding your own categories and web maps is accomplished by configuring groups and web maps within the organization. So for example, if you are an administrator for your ArcGIS Online organization, you might have a set of optimized maps for cartographers and designers. Or you only want certain maps to be searchable for the cartographers and designers. So how would you achieve it? First, to plan the type of data folder structure you want to have. I have an example here on the left-hand side, the geology and wildfire. So each organization has their own preference of how they want to set up their GIS folder structure. You may prefer to organize by data type, such as points, lines, polygon, or by data location, for example, by continent, state, or province. The example I have here shows the different categories for subcategories for a main category. For example, the geology is my main category, and hydrology, soils, and bedrocks are my subcategory. So once you've planned your data filing structure and have some layers and web maps that you want to be able to search for through the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension, you can begin creating groups. So for example, I have here a geology group. So when you create these groups, all you need to do is to add the tag M4CC. It stands for Maps for Creative Cloud. Makes sense, right? And a bar to the bar/pipe symbol to make sure this is accessible for people that are using the Maps for Creative Cloud extension. Okay. So next, this is the last slide before we go into the first demo. Some other best practices when you are designing your maps for publishing. So first is enable the query operation for vector data. This is because only services that have the query operation enabled can be successfully added to Illustrator as editable vector artwork. If query is disabled, the layer will be added as raster data. So the query operation is not required for Photoshop because all features added to Photoshop will be rasters. And the next one is ensure the max record count value of the services is large enough for designers to cover their map extent as the detail required. And also, you will want to adjust the wet map extent to cover the full extent of the data, because when browsing wet maps in the compilation window, only wet maps that have an extent that intersects with the current map board are displayed. And of course, you always want to document your wet map. In particular, you will probably want to include a thumbnail and a summary explaining your data for people who are using it and accessing it. So with that, I'll pass on to Mark, who will show us the first demo on how to set up and configure Adobe Creative Cloud.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina, and hi again, everybody. So this is going to come as a big shock to Christina and Ian and everyone else, but I think this is going to be my last webinar I'm ever going to do, because I've got this huge business idea that I'm going to execute featuring avocado toast. So let's bring up this business proposal that I am drafting, and I'm using Adobe InDesign to be able to build a pamphlet for my business proposal to create a avocado toast / fidget spinner hybrid. So I'm going to call this new product Fidgicado, and I'm going to be opening a bunch of new branches in the greater Vancouver area. So you can take a look here, again, my beginning of my first page of my pamphlet. I got this big white space. I'm going to use this a little bit later to put in a map of the world and show some potential expansion locations. As I scroll along, we'll also be able to see that there is sort of the main bulk of my business plan. I got a big white space here that I want to use to be able to show a map of the locations that I'm going to open in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver. So I need to build this map, and I'm going to use ArcGIS Maps for our Adobe Creative Cloud to be able to do that. Now, we do need to do a couple of preparation things before we begin that. First, we need to actually install the extension itself. So we can go to the Adobe Add-ons Marketplace. That's their page that you can go ahead and search. I've already logged in using my Adobe account. And here's a list of all the different add-ins, add-ons that they have available to the users of Adobe. I'm going to search for our ArcGIS Maps one, and as Christina mentioned, this is something that's relatively brand new. It's only been released for the last couple of weeks, but if you do a search using the keyword ArcGIS, you'll be able to find that there is indeed our brand new extension, ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. Now, you can learn more about the product here. It gives you some previews of what the product will look like, or what the extension will look like. And kind of something to keep in mind, there is a handy link here to the YouTube page where they have a number of different videos. So if you want to review some of the key things that we've done today, you can check out that YouTube page and be able to get that information pretty quickly. And there's some other information here as well, including some ratings and notes, etc. So all the usual stuff. Christina also mentioned what products this is supported for. So you can see over here on the right-hand side, it is supporting Illustrator and Photoshop, and from versions 2015 up to the most current version, which is 2017. Now you notice here that it's already been acquired, so I've already installed this. So, you know, we don't want to go through the process of actually adding the extension, but it's pretty easy. And just to ensure it works, you do want to go into that Creative Cloud menu and take a look at that activity stream, and you'll be able to see that indeed I have installed that Adobe Creative Cloud add-in from ArcGIS Maps. So make sure you have that sort of verified as you begin the process of working with this. Okay, now as I go back here into my map, I got this white space that I want to put in a map for my Lower Mainland locations, and it's approximately 10 inches by 6 inches. So I'm going to go into Illustrator and begin the creation of this 10 by 6 map that I want to put into that white space. So I'm going to go ahead and launch Illustrator. And Illustrator is primarily for vector data, and you'll see why we could take advantage of vectors in ArcGIS Maps as we go through the demo in a bit. So let's go ahead and launch Illustrator. And I'm going to create a brand new page or new artboard. And right now it's currently set to 10 by 6. That's good. That's exactly what I want. That's sort of this custom build that I have here. So let's go ahead and create that artboard. All right, so there's that artboard. I'm just going to make sure it fills up all the screen. There we go. Now, in order to take advantage of the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension, you'll need to load the extension. So once you've installed it, you'll see that there is an ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud option available from Windows extensions. So once I have that checked off, it's going to go ahead and launch these 3 windows that are available to us. So we're going to talk more about what map boards are, what processes are, what the compilation windows are. We'll talk about more of that in a bit. But for now, we do need to use our ArcGIS Online identity, our username and password, to be able to log in and use this product. So just as a minor note, you do need to be a level 2 user to do this. Here we go. And then we can start working with our map boards, our compilation, our processes, and we'll do that in the next step. So we'll save that for a couple of minutes. Now, there's a couple of other things that I do need to set up, and this is more on the ArcGIS Online side. So using that same login, I can go into my content page, and I see that there's a number of different feature layers and web maps that I have here. Some of these I don't want to necessarily share with my Adobe users. That's because these maps might be generalized, or it might be simplified, might be using more simple symbols. So we want to be able to filter those web maps and those layers that we want our Adobe users to use. So the key to that is to work with groups. So I have a couple of groups that I have designated for the Adobe Creative Cloud users. One is called Design Maps, another one is called Demographic Layers. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up Design Maps. As Christina mentioned, it's always good practice to be able to have things like thumbnails and descriptions for all your different items and for your group as well. So you want to always keep that avenue open to be able to make it easier to search and to be able to make it look better. So I'm just going to go into the details for our group. And as Christina mentioned, there are these tags that you can take advantage of. So here's a tag using M4CC Maps for Creative Cloud, and that tag has been specifically designated for Adobe Creative Cloud and ArcGIS Maps. So this is a way to be able to flag this group and make sure this group is opened for our Adobe users. And then whatever items are within that group we'll be able to access through Adobe Creative Cloud. And we'll actually show you what that looks like in the second demo. Now, there is another way to be able to take advantage of these tags. So I'm just going to go into our second group here, Demographic Layers, and access the same details page. You could also set a tag, M4CC, but you could also add a pipe to it. That's that straight line. And then a keyword afterwards. So this is kind of like a way to be able to create an alias for your content. So I created this alias called demographics, and once again in the second demo when we actually open some data, you'll be able to see that demographics show up in our display. Oh yeah, I should save this or cancel this, shouldn't I? Okay, so let's go ahead and cancel this. I do want to highlight a couple of other things. So you'll notice here that we do have different settings, and you want to make sure that these settings are optimized, so draw a little bit faster, so that's a good tip and trick. You also want to make sure that for things like data extents that you have that all set up. So say, for example, you want to be able to view your map and be able to view its extent. You'll see that the extent is here, so you might need to set that extent to make sure it covers all your data. That's something that Christina mentioned as well. One more thing to mention while we're here, and that is if you intend to create these feature layers in ArcGIS Online based on some maps that you have in, say, ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro. Now, if you're using Pro or you're creating your data directly from ArcGIS Online, this is not really a big deal. But if you're doing it from ArcMap and you want to be able to share this data as a service. So maybe you got a bunch of dissemination areas and you want to be able to save this as a feature layer in ArcGIS Online. You do need to be mindful, as Christina mentioned in the best practices slide, that you do keep in mind the maximum number of records that are being returned by the server. So you want to make sure that number is set to something really large, like 1,000 or 2,000, depending on your situation. And you also want to make sure that the query operation is turned on. So by default, it usually is. Just ensure that that query operation is available, so then when you do the syncing of your feature data, your points and lines and polygons into Adobe, it will interpret all of that as vectors as opposed to just a simple raster. All right, so that should take care of some of the logistical stuff. You make sure you set your groups, be able to use those tags, and also to be able to install Adobe and be able to start using it. So I'm going to pass things back to Christina, who's going to give us a background of what we just talked about and give us an idea of the workflow, and then I'll do a second demo to show you all of this in action. So Christina, back to you.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. So moving on to our, past that slide. Review and questions. We had a few questions that came in. Well, first, let's do a quick review. We talked about support environments, how to configure your ArcGIS Online organization for it to work with Adobe Creative Cloud, and how to add those Creative Cloud tags, and also installing the extension, start extension, and also how to configure the layer services settings in ArcMap. We had a question asking if it works on Mac, and yes, it works on both Mac and Windows, and also questions about how much does it cost. Users with an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription can download and use the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud app at no additional cost. So basically it's free if you already have that subscription, but you do need to have an ArcGIS Online Level 2 account. So those are the requirements. Okay. So how does it work? Let's move on to the real things. How does it work? First, let's describe a typical workflow when you're using this extension. First, you will search a map from ArcGIS Online inside Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop, and then you will preview to see if the map and its content meet your requirements. And then you will add the map to your Adobe workspace, either in Illustrator or Photoshop. And then you do your editing, map design, and then using the tools that you are familiar with. And then you produce the map with your design and branding as you wish. So let's talk about a few elements that you will work with when you are in Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. And the first thing we would like to talk about is map boards. So a map board is a geographic artboard. Mark briefly mentioned about it. In addition to width and height dimensions, it has a scale property that describes the distance on the map compared to the distance on the ground. It is not a preview of your work. It defines the size of your map and what area you want to work with. Things you will want to consider when you're creating your map board, the geographic extent, which is the area on the ground that will be displayed in the map. You also want to consider map scale, which is the ratio of the distance on the map to the corresponding distance on the ground. And also media scale, which is referring to the size on the page in which the area on the ground is displayed. You have two different workflow options when creating your map boards. One way is to use the Create Map Board tool to draw an area that represents a map, but alternatively, you can automatically generate a map board based on a wet map saved in ArcGIS Online. The next window is the compilation window. So you begin your map compilation in ArcGIS Maps compilation window. It's a separate window, and you would use this to preview your map in actual size. You can also add content such as wet maps, features image services. You can grab data from your organization, Living Atlas of the World, which includes demographic and traffic maps, web maps. You can also add local shape files if you wish. You can change the visibility, so updating the layer, you can change the visibility, name, and orders of the layers in the compiled map using the contents pane in the window. The resolution of image layer in the compiled maps can be modified to produce high-resolution images to work with Illustrator or Photoshop. This applies to all image layers in the compiled map, including base maps and any other raster layers. Once the map board is created, you can change the resolution with other steps. Similar to a layer resolution, the map projection can be modified using the current map board settings. This enables you to preview the map in the custom projection before it's downloaded, so you can adjust extent or scale as needed before you proceed to download. There's also another Change Style button that will allow you to edit your symbology in the window. It gives you access to styling capabilities available in ArcGIS Online. So the compilation window allows you to review the content added and updated the layer structure before you sync to Illustrator or Photoshop. And Mark will give us a demo in just a few minutes. After adding the geographic content to your map board in the compilation windows, you can use the sync function to download the content into Illustrator or Photoshop. This step is simply copying the data to your workspace. It doesn't affect the source layer at all. And syncing data in Photoshop and Illustrator are very similar in nature, but with a few main differences in the sync map layer structure. So in Adobe Illustrator, the layer structure of a downloaded map will be the same as the map's original layer structure. So if it's a vector, it will be vector. If it's features, it will be features, and base map will be downloaded as rasters. In Photoshop, downloaded vector data in Photoshop will be changed to rasters, but you can use vector data as you want, but it will just change to raster. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Processes and settings. So processes are actions that run on the map in Adobe Illustrator to organize the downloaded artwork. And sometimes processes are used to streamline map design, so it will automatically run through some tools. For example, there's a tool removing clip paths, orders, and grouping excessive groups, and differentiating layers by unique color. These will provide you an AI file, Adobe Illustrator file, that is streamlined and ready for your cartographic enhancements. So it will save you a lot of time. You have the option of the setting. You have the option to set up these processes to be automatically run upon each sync, and you can also run them manually if you wish. This window shows how you can run the processes automatically, and of course, you can, like I said, you can run it manually as well if you don't want to, if you don't want the process to run every single time. And the settings window, it is what it is. You can check general information on your map. You can change some options. You can change the projection and maybe some library options. And with that, I'll pass things back to Mark again, who will show us how to create a map in Adobe Illustrator.
Oh, let's try the mute button. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to build one of these maps for our pamphlet, and we're going to begin with a web map. So I'm going to go and start back here in ArcGIS Online, and I want to show you this potential locations web map that I have. And this is a pretty straightforward web map, right? There's nothing too extraordinary about it. I do have some locations that I'm considering, so you can see those are all labeled here. These are actually, this avocado spinner is going to be so huge. I'm looking at Sears stores in Vancouver that may close soon. I hope not, but I want to take advantage because I think so many people are going to hit these avocado toasts that we want that huge space. So here are the 6 locations that I'm considering. I've also used the analysis tool and created these 10-minute drive times around each of their stores, and also put in a label in there so we can have the label of them all. You'll notice that we are using a unique symbol. That's our avocado toast logo. In a web map, you want to be strategic about this, especially for Adobe users, because these symbols will not carry over when you use them in Illustrator, but we can certainly re-symbolize those within Illustrator, and I'll show you how to do that in a couple of secs. Okay, so there's the background. We kind of know what we're doing. Let's use that web map to be able to create the map within Adobe Illustrator. So, as Christina mentioned, there are these different windows that we work with on ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, and the first one is the Map Boards window. Now, the key thing about the Map Boards window is that it is not a preview. It is here to establish 3 things. The first thing we need to establish is a geographic location or extent. So I'm just going to do the quick search into Vancouver, and it kind of takes us into the right area. Now, we want to make sure that we get all of the lower mainland here because we're going all the way out to Langley. The other things that we need to establish here is going to be based on the map scale and on the media size. So let's go ahead and define an area that we want to use for our map board. And I can do it a couple of ways. The first way is kind of interactively. I can go ahead and drag a box of the area that I want. And then it prompts me. So it's going to prompt me for a name. So I'll just call this Vancouver. And then I could define it based on the media size, which is 10 inches by 6 inches. So it picks up the size of my artboard, and I can use that to define my area. Or I could do it based on a specific scale. So just for now, let's go ahead and define it based on the artboard dimensions, 8 by 6. Then we can modify the location of this based on those 10 by 6 dimensions to be able to get exactly what I want in terms of the area of my geographic extent. So that's certainly one way to be able to do this. Another way is to be able to use an existing web map. So we already have that web map that I showed you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that web map and use that as my geographic extent. So we can do this based on a location of our web map. I'm going to go into my organization, and you see these 2 words here, demographics and design maps. Those come from that M4CC tag that I showed you in the first demo. So design maps, that's the one that's using just M4CC, and it shows up as is. And then demographics, I use as that pipe word. Remember, there was an M4CC pipe demographics. So it puts in that key category, and then from inside that, I could go ahead and I could access layers from that demographic layers group. So in our case, we want to work with maps, and there is our potential locations web map. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add this in, and I'm going to use that as my extent. Now right now, you'll notice that it doesn't really match the 10 by 6 dimensions that I want. So here's where you need to be a little bit more proactive, especially if you're using a web map and you want to fit it in that map board area. You might need to change some of these different values to get it closer to 10 by 6. Oops. Let me type this in again here. Here we go. And you might need to manipulate this a little bit to be able to get exactly the area you want. So just be careful about that. If you're doing this from a web map, you might need to make some adjustments to be able to fit exactly the dimensions that you want. And it's still not quite 10 by 6, so I'm just going to make a couple more adjustments here to make it in the right place. One more thing you notice is that you can have multiple map boards. So depending on the name you want to use, you can have as many map boards as you want, and you can use these different map boards as needed. Okay, so I got this potential locations map board. Now I'm going to, I've already defined exactly the area that I want, so now I'm going to go into the compilation window. And to do that, I'll just click on this simple button here to be able to preview and add content. So that will take me into this compilation window. And here's where I can see the web map that we built, and it is now within the framework of the 10 by 6 dimensions that I wanted. Great. So there's a couple of things that I can do here. First thing I can do is I can add in some additional layers. So again, I could go ahead and I can add regular feature layers, like these could be map layers, or they could be feature layers, they could be image layers. I can add those in. I can also add in a web map, I've already done that. And you can also add in a shapefile. So let's first add in an additional layer. So I want to add some demographic data that I have in my demographics folder that shows some income based on dissemination areas in Greater Vancouver. All right, so there is that demographic layer. And with this contents panel, you can go ahead and you can rearrange the layers. So I want my DAs to be on the bottom. You can also change the style of these. So maybe I want to base this based on the average income. And then from here, we could go ahead and we can change some of the different parameters. So do I want to use natural breaks? Do I want to change the symbol style? Do I want to add in some transparency? So all of those things that you're familiar with in ArcGIS Online or even in ArcGIS Pro, you can certainly implement those here as well. Click OK. All right, now one more thing I want to add in is I want to add in some of my competitors. So I have that stored in a separate shapefile. So I'm going to go ahead and add in that shapefile. It's just that shapefile is zipped up in a zip file. And we can go ahead and we can add in where our competition is for avocado toast. I just went into Yelp and saw where the hot avocado places are in Vancouver. You could rename layers. There we go. You could change the symbol of these as well. So maybe I want to change it to something a little bit more palatable. So you can go ahead and you could change the fill to a different color. And off you go. All right. So we're getting pretty close to the map that I want to sync, but there is that one issue about the symbols. So you notice that in the web map, the unique symbols that I had for my avocado spinner aren't showing up here. But what I could do is I could add those symbols if I wanted to. So a couple of ways to be able to do this. Well, one specific way of doing it, but it takes a couple of steps. So if I go into my symbols section for this particular diagram, I could go ahead and I can load in some different libraries. Now, with the extension of ArcGIS Maps, we have added a number of out-of-the-box symbols that you can certainly use. So if I wanted to, I can take advantage of maybe the red map and maybe the gray map. And you can add those in for sure. But we can also add in some custom libraries with our own custom symbols. So I happen to create one here. Just going to go ahead and find it. There it is. And this is the one that has our avocado toast spin. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in as well. Now notice the name of this is called locations. So the next key thing to remember is that when you want to set up your symbols for your map, you need to make sure that the name of your layer is the same as the name of the symbol. So when I go back to our compilation window, I need to rename this to be able to match the name of the symbol that we just loaded in. Now, in this case, it happens to be the same name. That's good. We'll make it easy. But if you do need to change that name, this is the place where you do it. All right, a couple more things we need to set up here. We do need to go back into our map board section, and under settings, we need to point to that same library file. So here under settings, you see that there is a custom library that we're integrating, and we're pointing to that same AI file that I just added in to Illustrator. And then the last thing we need to set up is we need to set up the processes. So Christina mentioned this additional window that's out there to be able to sync different processes, and you could either do it automatically when you do the sync, or you can run it manually if you wanted to. So here we want to make sure that we take advantage of those custom symbols. So we're going to make sure that that option is checked, and we're going to run this with the sync. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and do that download or that sync. So here we have that option to be able to sync the map into our artwork layers. So this will take a couple of seconds. And what's happening here is taking this data that we're looking at, and it's going to vectorize it and add it to our artboard in Illustrator. So of course this is not going to affect the source data. All of our source data is still going to remain exactly the same. This is making a physical copy or vectorizing all of that data into our artboard. Now, the base map also gets carried over, but because it is a base map, it's going to be carried over as a raster. All right, so just finishing up here. Give it a couple more secs. Hope I didn't blow this up. All right, here we go. So now we're here in our artboard. It's taken all of that data and has copied it into our artboard. And you'll notice here that the symbols are now using those custom symbols that I pointed to. So that part has been fixed. And basically that's it. Now it's all part of your regular Adobe usage. So you're going to do Adobe things to what you see here. So we could go ahead, we could take a look at all the layers. We could break it down and be able to see that we have our base map. We could turn that on or off. Then that's all one big raster. We can go ahead and we can get rid of things. So maybe this Esri logo, I don't like it. That's fine. You can go ahead and delete it. You can also delete things like the scale bar. Maybe that scale bar is not the prettiest. You want to add in your own later on. You can certainly get rid of that. You can also get rid of that copyright text. You don't like that, sure, get rid of that too. And then the rest of it is just sort of Adobe things, right? Let me turn on that layer again, our base map, just so we can see it there. Here it is. So we can go ahead and we can add in or remove things. So maybe I don't want the dissemination areas for Maple Ridge, so I could go ahead and use my lasso tool and get rid of those. Oops, shouldn't have done that. Let's do this undo here. You can tell this demo is real. All right, so we can go ahead and we can delete these different polygons that we don't want. There we go. And we could go ahead and we can add in our base maps again so we don't lose those. Something like that. Not the prettiest. We could also take care of these labels. So right now these labels are currently, takes those labels and just transfers them as text. Maybe I want to shorten each of these to be able to just show the actual mall name instead of all these extra words that are not necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little modification here to make it look the way I want. Get rid of center. So you can see now you're just doing sort of the fun Adobe things that Adobe people love to do, right? Be able to manipulate graphics, etc. I could even, if I wanted to, be able to place maybe a logo that I have. So let's go ahead and add in our banner here. Here we go. And we can have that as part of our final map. And then simply, once we have our conditions set, we have the map exactly the way we want it, we go ahead and save this. I'm just going to save this as our Adobe Illustrator file. Here we go. And my work is pretty well done. I can now go back into InDesign. You go into that empty space, File, Place, point to that AI file that I just created. There it is. And I'm just going to put it into that spot. So hopefully that gives you a taste of the basic workflow when you're working with ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, right? So you need to find your map, do that search. Once you do that, then you could go ahead and you can add in some content that you want to be able to work with. From there, you'll be able to do the download and that sync to be able to take all that geographic data and put it into an artboard in Illustrator. And then from there, you do your regular Illustrator stuff, right? You can make the edits, add things, remove things, add your own branding, add your own colors. You can modify the text, remove things that you don't want, like the scale bar and the copyright text and the logos. It's all up to you. You can go ahead and be your creative self and make those modifications. And then last but not least, you can go ahead and you can add in your final graphic into your work, like I did here with my graphic. Wow, that's a lot of work, and I'm going to do this all over again, but I'm going to do it on the Photoshop side. So I'm going to set that up. While I'm setting that up, I'm going to pass things back to Christina, who I think has a few more questions that have been coming in from you guys. So Christina, I'll pass things back to you.
Thanks, Mark. I absolutely love your new business proposal, CG Ocado. It sounds delicious. Make sure you open some stores in Toronto. Okay, while Mark is setting up, we'll take a few more questions. We did have a question that came in asking if you have to access the data through ArcGIS Online, what about regular ArcMap? Mark showed earlier how you can publish the service to ArcGIS Online through ArcMap, or you can zip up your data into a shapefile and bring it into Illustrator or Photoshop. Someone also asked about what is an ArcGIS Online Level 2 user. How do you know? The easiest way to find out is to log into your ArcGIS Online account and see if you have a My Content tab. If you do have My Content, that means you're a Level 2 user. Level 1 user is basically a viewing user. So if you're Level 2, you have the ability to create, share content, and edit content. And that's basically what it is. I also have a question about what about a legend? I'm afraid you probably have to elaborate on that question for a little bit more. I'm not sure if you're asking about creating a legend or removing a legend. In Illustrator, you do have the ability to create your customized legend and things like that. I also have a question. If you update the data map in ArcGIS Online, will the map update on the Adobe Artboard as well, or once it's converted to Adobe Artboard, it is no longer synced to ArcGIS Online? I'm not 100% sure about that question, but I think once you sync that data to your map board, it becomes part of your projects. And if you want to update, I think you have to create a new map board, bring that updated data to your map board again.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Christina. You're absolutely right. So once you do that sync and you download the data to your artboard, it is downloading that data and it's independent of the service itself. So if you make an update to your service, you'll need to either rebuild that artboard by resyncing it again.
So if you're ready, we're going to move on to the last demonstration of the day, how to use ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud in Photoshop. Mark?
Great, thank you very much. And you know what? The story is exactly the same thing as in Illustrator, except for a couple of differences. So we'll highlight those as we go along. So you may have remembered that I do have this white space up here on my pamphlet to be able to show my worldwide expansion of my brand, and I want to highlight those locations in a map. So I'm going to use Photoshop to be able to do this. Now the area here is about 7 inches by 5 inches. I've already measured that out. So I've already went ahead and I created here in Photoshop that artboard that is 7 by 5, and I'm going to go ahead and build a map for this map board. So same thing applies. We could go ahead and start with ArcGIS Maps map board window, and we're going to define a extent. So this is a worldwide extent, so I want to make sure I get all of the world here. So I'm going to go ahead and interactively define that box around here. 7 by 5, we're going to use that artboard size. We'll just call the name of the map board world. And there it is. Okay? And let's go ahead and we can export this. So let's go ahead and go to the compilation window, and it will take us to that extent of the entire world. Perfect. This is exactly what I want. Now, I'm going to add in a couple of extra layers to this. The first layer actually comes from an image service. So here we have our world imagery, and this is the items details page, so it gives us some details about this world imagery service. It can be a tile layer, it could be an image layer. All of those are acceptable. But the key thing is if I want to use this layer, I can go ahead and copy that URL. Okay, so this is pointing to an ArcGIS online item. Then when I go here into the compilation page, I can add a layer, just like we did before, but instead of adding it based on an ArcGIS location, I can add it based on the item URL. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paste that URL here, and that should point to the World Imagery Service, and I'm going to go ahead and add that into my compilation window. And because we already have sort of this main map, I'm going to delete that light gray canvas base map. We don't need it. All right, I'm going to add in one more layer. And this layer is going to be in our ArcGIS Online organization. So if you go to here under Design Maps, oops. Oh, hang on here. Let's add it in the other way. We add it in via Web Maps. And then from here, we could go ahead and we could go into our organization and pick out that world expansion map. All right, close. Now, because I added in as a web map, it got rid of that extra layer that I had before. So I'm just going to add it in one more time just so it's there. Kind of did it in the wrong order, but the same principles apply. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll get rid of that base map layer. And we have our map that we want with our world imagery and then our expansion cities that we want to have added in. Okay, so right now you can take a look at this world map and you can say, man, that is ugly, right? We have that web Mercator and everything is skewed in the poles. It doesn't look the way I want. So I can take advantage of this map board settings, which will allow me to do a couple of things. The first thing is I can change the resolution, the dots per inch of this image I'm going to be exporting. That's really useful if you want the fine details to be shown, so you can always increase, or if you want to make it small, you can always decrease that number. So I'll just leave it as the default, but that's something that you can certainly consider when you're doing that export, especially with imagery. The second thing is the map projection. I'm going to change the map projection of this. If you know the WKID, you can certainly use that, but in our case, I'm just going to do the key search word on Robinson. I like the Robinson projection, and we're going to go ahead and use that as our reprojected map that we're going to export. All right, so now that I've done what I need to do, I'm going to go ahead and sync this. Once again, that sync is going to take this content that we've compiled, it's going to add it into our artboard, and it's going to download all of that data. So again, it kind of loses that live link to our original data set. But now we could go ahead and we can manipulate this as we see fit. Now, if we look at the layers in this case, you notice that it is going to be significantly different than what we saw earlier. So in Illustrator's case, it took those vectors and it created individual layers for each of those vectors. But you can see here, because we're using Photoshop and it's dealing directly with rasters, both the points and the world map underneath are part of the same layer. So that's one key difference of whether you're using Photoshop versus Illustrator. If you want to combine all your data and just create one sort of grand image of it, use Photoshop. But if you want to utilize those points and lines and polygons, those vectors, then use Illustrator. Same thing goes, I could go ahead and I can get rid of the logo. So I don't like the Esri logo. Goodbye. I don't like the scale bar. Goodbye. I don't like the copyright text. Goodbye. And you're left with that main map. And then from here, it's the same thing, right? File, save as. We're going to save this as a TIFF image. We'll throw it here on our desktop, fine. All right, so we go ahead and we can save this as an image. Then we go back into InDesign, File, Place, point to that World TIFF image that I just created, and hopefully place it somewhere in my map. Where did it place it? Oh, there it is. Wrong place. Let's edit undo. And we'll do it one more time for fun. There it is. There it goes. All right, so there's our final world map, and we can now have that as part of our pamphlet. So hopefully that gives you an illustration of the typical workflow in Photoshop. It's basically exactly the same. Just remember that the output is dealing with one large raster as opposed to individual vector layers. And then you're off and running. You can go ahead and you can create some pretty cool maps for your pamphlet. I don't think this avocado toast thing is going to work out, so I guess I have to do more webinars. Sorry, Christina, for that bad news. But we'll pass it back to you, and you'll go ahead and wrap this up, and then we'll take some more of your questions. Christina.
Thank you, Mark. And I have to say I'm definitely disappointed that it's not going to work out and you still have to do webinars with me.
Oh.
But anyways, in summary, in this webinar, we showed you how to get started with ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, how to set it up. And we also, Mark walked through a typical workflow using Adobe Illustrator to create a map and also using Adobe Photoshop. And at this point, we had more questions that came in, so I'm going to take some questions. And Mark, if I missed any, you can maybe help me to catch it. It's on Fidjo Cattle, and thank you for taking the time. And please fill up the survey when you're available. And if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Mark. And at this point, if you would like to stick around, Mark and I will take a few more questions. Thank you, guys.